All right, good afternoon, fellow Rotarians. Welcome to our, Aaron and I have now termed it, welcome to our Rotary Celebration of Service on a weekly basis. So Rotary Celebration of Service. I like that. I cannot take credit. That is Aaron, our upcoming president, determined that. So thank you, Aaron. So welcome to our weekly Rotary Celebration of Service. I'm Lawrence Snyder, president of the club. Thank you all for being here. As you leave, as I walked in, did you see our new market across the way? I mean, that happened overnight, didn't it? All right, I want to thank our greeter today, Sarah Laughlin, and roundabout reporter Kyla Cox-Deckard. So also want to invite Owen, where are you? Owen, up for our pledge and reflection. Owen.
Please join me in the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
This is one of those wonderful days when one could reflect on all sorts of things. Obviously, it's election day. And I grew up in a family that was interested in politics. My dad's hobby was politics. He was a county chairman for 11 years as a Democrat. My older brother loved politics in Annapolis, Maryland, and served a term as mayor of Annapolis as a Republican. And I also remember how my name was for about 10 years mentioned every year at the training for election officers in the county that I grew up in. And that's because I remained registered there even though I was living in Michigan. But it started during the Vietnam War, and I didn't know if I might be called to duty at some point, so I just remained registered originally, and the county auditors in Washington State were in charge of the election, always mentioned me to the election workers to say, just because somebody hasn't shown up to vote doesn't mean he or she will not vote. But I also want to review our Rotary toast from last Friday. Alumni Hall was full. I mean, we probably could have stuffed in a couple of more tables. We honored Connie and Steve Ferguson, John Weichart, Michael McRobbie, Pete Yolkman, and Steve Rodinaro all spoke. A variety of toasting positions. One was more of a roast than a toast, but it fit in with the spirit, and Steve Ferguson was particularly receptive. He has a mind that remembers everything. I sat next to him at the Women's NIT Championship game last year, and he recalled not only who I was, but what we had talked about, and I was amazed by that. In the three previous toasts, we raised $109,000. This one raised $60,000 by itself. So that's $169,000, and now we can point to next year for the Rotary Toast. Put it on your calendars, November 1st, 2019, and I'm sure it will be even better than any of the ones that we have had so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Owen. Michael Shermis, introduction of our guests. Michael, sir.
Thanks, Lauren. If our guests could please stand as I call your name so we can recognize you. First, we have Andrew Lambert from Lambert Consulting. He's a guest of the club. And then Adam Novello. He is a prospective club member from Youth First. Al Feidel, guest of Liz Feidel. And Trent Decker, a guest of Kyla Cox Decker. Okay. Evan Fruits is a visiting Rotarian, a guest of Walt Kuhn. And then 2 guests from Dan Preston, Amado Preston, and Corrine Preston. Yeah. Thanks to all of you, and if you ever have any questions, ask anybody at your table about Rotary.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate that. Welcome to everybody, all of our guests today. Birthdays this week, and basically looking back over the past week, birthdays and anniversaries. The only birthday we had is Beth Rodriguez on the 9th of this month, so happy birthday to Beth. Membership anniversaries over the past week plus, we had quite a few. First, I have Phil Eskew, and Phil, you're celebrating your first year here in Bloomington, but I believe, is it 36 is what my document said, 36 years? Almost 38, so we're a little off. Congratulations. Thank you, Phil. We have Bess Bradley at 1 year, Lynn Schwartzberg 11 years, Peter Kroner 14 years, Bob Holt 25 years, Jack McCrory 32 years, Dick McKeag 33 years, and Art Lotz 38 years. Holy cow. A few pre-program announcements here. We are going to have a quick membership meeting after this meeting. So Liz, myself, we'll just meet back at the back table or something where Liz is at. We're going to do that immediately following our meeting. Real quickly, because it's something I'm passionate about, and I have the microphone right now. Joy and I had Ryla 2 weekends ago. An incredible experience, 80 plus youth from our district. And if you want to be inspired, join us for a portion of that weekend. And I just want to read an excerpt from one of their letters. They send club sponsor letters back to their clubs thanking them for their experience. One of our Bloomington representatives, it is one, in quote, "It is one experience that I will remember for the rest of my life. This trip to Ryla has taught me more about what Rotary is all about and everything that helps our communities. Ryla is wonderful, and I'm so thankful to be here. Thank you, Bloomington Rotary." And then also, I thought it was interesting, Sydney Goodlett, you might remember Bailey Goodlett, who went to Ryla a few years ago. Sydney is a freshman at Bloomington South High School, and she was there as Bailey was helping us volunteer and chaperone. So the family continues to cycle through Ryla. Just an honor and a privilege to be there, and I know Joy feels the same way. All right, the business outlook was last Thursday, very well attended by both Rotarians and community members. Owen referenced the toast honoring Steve and Connie Ferguson. Should net over $60,000 over $60,000 to the causes. So an incredible amount of work and effort went into that. Quarterly lunch buddies, myself and Don Colglazer actually met, and I'm not going to say much about it, but on July 12th, 1972, American Airlines Flight 633 was hijacked. Don will cover the details if you're interested. An incredible story. 12 months of service. We continued that for October at the Wonder Lab in the Wonder Garden. We had a great turnout of volunteers and some other service opportunities real quickly. Ashley, where are you? Ashley? We're going to get an update on a couple events going on for service in the upcoming months. So I'll ask Ashley, Steve Moberly, and then Art, if you want to say anything as well about the telefund, we can go through that real quickly. So, Ashley.
Just a quick opportunity that won't take too much time, effort, but it'll make a huge difference. We're making up some food baskets for Macam. So we need some items. You can bring in anything from the list that you'll receive on your way out and drop it off with Natalie or myself. And we'll put together baskets and drop them off in December. But we've got 4 meetings coming up that you can bring the items. So just stop by the store, pick up a couple cans of vegetables or some mac and cheese, and drop it off, and we'll be doing a lot of good in the community. Thanks.
What's the time frame? 4 meetings?
The next 4 meetings. So we need to deliver them on December 7th, so you have 4 weeks to bring them in, and we'll pack them all up.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you, Ashley. Steve, you want to come on up? Talk about our bell ringing, I believe.
It's hard to believe, but next month is December, and our club has had a long history and tradition of ringing the bell for the Bloomington Salvation Army. Red Kettles on Saturdays, and we'll be doing that again this year. I want to thank Glenda Murray again for setting up our sign-up website, Sign Up Genius. The link was in last week's roundabout, and our capable club assistant, Natalie, tells me that it will be sent out separately in the next couple of days, so look for that. We hope you'll sign up. We'll be ringing at College Mall, the south entrance near Anthony Pets and across from where the computer store used to be. It'll be on 4 Saturdays, December 1st, 7th, 15th, and the 22nd. There'll be 4 shifts of 1 hour each, starting at 10 a.m. and concluding at 2 p.m. And we'd like to have 2 Rotarians per shift because it helps to pass the time if you have someone to talk with. So please consider signing up to ring the bells for the Salvation Army. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Steve. And for November, our project is the WFIU, WTIU Telefund. Art, you want to give us quick details on that?
It's pretty simple. You just sit there and take calls and type the names and the amounts in. It's on a Sunday and a Wednesday. The Wednesday, I believe, is taken care of. We need just 4 people for Sunday. Just 4 people. And we're covering the whole week, and that we'll get a lot of advertising, a lot of bennies from this.
This coming Sunday?
Is it the 25th or 28th? Which one is which?
I forget.
Wednesday and a Sunday.
Wednesday and a
Somebody have a
Sunday.
calendar?
25th is a Sunday.
Okay.
The 25th, we need 4 people for.
So November 25th, we need 4 volunteers to receive calls for the telefund. So keep that in mind for our... In the evening, I believe? Yeah. Art, do you want to manage the sign-ups or somebody to touch base with you?
Sign Up Genius. We'll send that out again.
Yeah. So we've got a lot of service opportunities coming at you for November between the MACM bringing supplies and things and the telefund, and then December, MACM continued in addition to the bell ringing. So tons of opportunities. That's why we're here, is to serve our community and world. Last announcement, it's election day. Go vote. Happy Dollars. Susie, are you? Yep, Susie. Happy Dollars.
I'm going to start us off. $1 doesn't seem appropriate, but I'm happy to give it on behalf of Biden Tech, who will be benefiting from Connie and Steve's beneficence at so thank you. So we're very happy. And here I've got Jim Harvey right next to me.
I've got $2, one paid only voted once today. And second, the other $1 is Bob Salter. I have known Bob in the club for a long time. If you don't know Bob, he's a community jewel. He being here, being part of the Herald Times, I value the newspaper and I value Bob.
I'm giving $1 in honor of all those people who are not here because they are either out canvassing or not canvassing. Out for candidates or are a candidate or are working at the polls.
Absolutely. Julia, go ahead.
This is a happy $1 because I have finally made up my mind, and I'm sure everybody who's listened to me for the last 2 months, I am not going to permanently move to Thailand. I'm going to move to Meadowood, back to Meadowood to one of the small bedrooms, 1-bedroom apartments. So.
Good for you. Yeah, Art, go ahead.
Yes. Well, I'm on the glad last December. Getting your house ready for sale has been a real ordeal. A lot of surprises, and anyway, we have closing in a week and a half. So.
Hi, my name is Alicia. I'm from the One Club. I have a personal happy $1. My 18-year-old finished all her college applications without my help.
Yeah, Tim's got one.
I'm not sure if our president is observing it or not, but I'm observing No Shave November. Recognize men that have suffered with and been successful in overcoming cancer, particularly prostate cancer, which I have. And I also want to congratulate our community. We did have a chance last week, particularly Brian Besser, for organizing an interfaith remembrance of people that were killed in the synagogue in Pittsburgh. And our president acknowledging also this is a great job.
Yeah, Linda.
And I just want to say, I saw many of you at Wayne Martin's memorial, but it was a wonderful service, and I learned so much from Bill Baldwin, who talked, and from David Meyer. And so, if you get the chance to talk to them about all the things that Wayne did for our community. Bill Fergus, thank you.
Charlotte, did you have one?
This community which gives us so many opportunities to serve, because so many people do so many different need issues, we try to solve them.
Awesome. Thank you, Charlotte. Thank you, Susie. I think that is everybody. All right. Without any further ado, Charlotte, I'm going to ask you to stand back up and come up here and introduce our program for the day. Need a hand? Got it?
Yep.
All right.
I assume everybody got their copy of the Rotarian, The Great War, which will have been not concluded, but armisticed out as of the next November 11th, 11 a.m. at the 11th month, the 11th day, 11 o'clock in the morning at 11 minutes. It was not the end of the Great War, it was the beginning of the next century, which has brought us all sorts of results. It was the war to end all wars, and then we had the peace to end all peace, and that's where we are now. I think it's something that we should all acknowledge. For some reason, it just engages my interest tremendously. I've just read a lot about it. And so I thought we needed to recognize it here at Rotary, and I was really happy that the Rotarian came out. It's quite an extensive article, and I hope you'll go back and read it. When I think of the First World War, partly because I've read a lot of English books, there's tremendous good literature coming out of the First World War, and much of it is from Britain. And I think of the trenches, and I think of the war taking place in those trenches up along the Belgian, French, German, Netherlands line. But in fact, it was a world war. And the world part of it will be addressed particularly by our speaker today. Germany really had their hands in all over the world. And there were little skirmishes and fights and battles, and people were killed, and things. And the end of the war resulted in a lot of divvying up German lands. So she'll talk about that today. Michelle Moyd has been a professor in the history department here for the last 10 years. She spent some time in Germany. She lived in Germany. And she spent some time in Germany, but she got her PhD in Cornell, and she wrote on the German involvement in World War I, and she'll be talking to us about the extensive World War I that we don't always know about. Thank you very much, Michelle Moyd.
Well, thank you all for having me here today, especially Charlotte. Thank you for inviting me to do this. I am going to talk specifically about the war in Africa, and I hope that it is something that will perhaps inspire you to look into the war as a world war as we approach the anniversary of the armistice, and as we approach the next year. We'll be doing this commemoration for the signing of the Versailles Treaty and kind of the introduction to a new world order 100 years ago. So as Charlotte mentioned, when we think of World War I, there are certain kinds of familiar images that come to mind. These include mechanized mass mobilization that sent soldiers to war, the horrors of trench warfare, poison gas, barbed wire, muddy fields strewn with body parts, moonscapes created by artillery fire, and so on. Yet almost never do we reflect on why this war is referred to as a world war. And certainly it's equally rare that discussions of World War I include Africa. This is because World War I is usually portrayed as a war between European nations, a white man's war of monstrous proportions, and those proportions include something on the order of 37 million casualties, some 16 million people died, and some 21 million were wounded. And of those, in terms of the breakdown between military personnel and civilians, of those who died, 9.7 million were military and 6.8 million were civilians. Campaigns fought in other parts of the world beyond Europe are viewed often as sideshows to the European theater, rendering the experiences of the majority of those who lived through them invisible. And so I would point you here to the film The African Queen, for example, or novelistic treatments of the war, such as An Ice Cream War by William Boyd, that foreground the experiences of Europeans during the war and essentially ignore Africans. But the war was also fought between empires, and because of that, Africans too made tremendous sacrifices and suffered traumas that they framed within their own local understandings of conflict, colonialism, and labor. So what I'd like to do today is just offer you a glimpse of the war in Africa with a focus on presenting some African perspectives on the war and to reflect on what it meant for African peoples. For some 2 million Africans from across the continent, the war meant conscription, either as laborers or soldiers, often under hellish conditions. Moreover, many African men were sent to fight far away from their homes, including in Europe and the Dardanelles, and from one side of the continent to the other, actually. African soldiers' oral histories have documented their experiences, showing the often profoundly jarring military, social, and cultural experiences that shaped them as young men. The scale of manpower mobilization for war, soldiers, and laborers was unprecedented in African history. For untold millions of non-combatants, the war caused destruction of their lands, crops, and livelihoods. It also caused profound changes in African social arrangements to include gender relations and generational hierarchies. It caused deadly famines and an influenza pandemic with devastating consequences for Africans and everyone else, of course. If you know anything about the war at all, you know that right about this time, 100 years ago, was also kind of the beginning of the spread of this horrific influenza pandemic, which killed millions of people around the world. Finally, the war changed the imperial map of Africa so that Africans in the former German territories had to learn to live under new regimes administered by British, French, Belgian, and South African mandate authorities, which was a key outcome of the Versailles Treaty, which took force in January of 1920. So the war created a new category of social actors who would argue for privileged positions in society from their standpoint as war veterans, invoking an idea of military respectability that made them potentially formidable social and political actors. In their view, the colonizers owed them a so-called blood debt in repayment of their sacrifices in the Great War. And for the most part, they would be disappointed. So I know for some of you in the back this may be too small to really make out, but I'll just make one main point about this map, which is a map of Africa as it sort of looked geopolitically in 1914. And how should I do this? Can you see the cursor? Yeah, okay. So these orange, I think it's okay. I can just use this cursor and hopefully people can kind of make out that I'm moving it. But basically these orange spaces on the map are were the four German colonies on the continent of Africa. And all of the rest of the territories around them are spaces that were colonized by Entente powers. So the British, the French, the Belgians, South Africans who were sub-imperial power to the British, Portuguese who were neutral at first but joined the war effort on the Entente side later. So just from looking at that map, you should be able to tell some things about why the war went the way it did for the Germans over the course of those 4 years. I'll come back to that in a minute. But the assumption going into the war was that Germany would remain, or the colonial spaces would remain neutral, but that was not the case. And in fact, all of these territories came under assault by the Allies right away. And so in Togo, the war was basically over for the German colonial authorities by August 1914, within 2 weeks of the war starting. In German Southwest Africa, the space was occupied by South African force by mid-1915. Cameroon was occupied by a combined British and French force by mid-1916. And so the last one, the one that took the longest to sort of, the longest campaign of the four that were fought on the African continent was German East Africa, which is today Tanzania, which did not end until about 2 weeks after the armistice was signed on November 11th. Basically because the commander, the German commander there, it took a long time for him to get the information that the armistice had been signed because he was out in the field without adequate communication. So this chart, the main thing I wanted to just point out here is that the colonial armies that operated in Africa at this time were quite small. They were designed for one purpose, which was essentially to secure colonial territories for the Europeans and to maintain that control and to police the colonized peoples who lived within those borders. And so this is just a chart taken from the official British military history of the war in East Africa, which documents the recruitment numbers or rise in recruitment numbers over the course of the 4 years for the King's African Rifles, which was the British colonial force in East Africa. And you'll see here that it starts out with something like 2,000, and over the course of 4 years it grows at least tenfold, actually more than tenfold. And then it begins to go back down as the war ends. I show you these numbers to make a couple of points. One is that these were never big armies. So there is actually a reason why these campaigns get treated as sideshows, because in the consciousness of people, the real numbers that matter are the ones that killed millions on the Western Front, for example. But and then the second point, just to show you that despite the fact that these armies were quite small, a tenfold increase in recruitment is a tenfold increase in recruitment. This is a dramatic building of an army over the course of 4 years to fight a campaign in which most of these men would have had very little stake except to continue to demonstrate their desire for respectability and to continue to be able to operate as important men within colonial societies. So I can answer more questions about these armies if you're interested. In the interest of time, I'm going to move on to try to give you a sense of at least one soldier who was involved in fighting in Africa during the war. This man's name is Kande Kamara, pictured here, probably in his 60s or 70s. He was interviewed by a historian named Joe Lunn in the early 70s when he was doing his dissertation research, and he collected this rich set of oral histories of men like Conde Camara who fought for the French during World War I, both in West Africa, where the main French colonies were, and in other places, like on the Western Front itself, in the Dardanelles campaign, and elsewhere. One of the key points to raise about the war effort in Africa is that there were massive recruitment drives to get men to sign up to fight, and the French were sort of in the vanguard of this because they had the bigger problem with manpower for waging war in Europe. If you know anything about the history of Europe in the early 20th century, the French were suffering from a smaller population. They were concerned about their population growth vis-a-vis their enemy, Germany, next door. And so one of the things that they did was to try and recruit as many soldiers as they could from their colonial holdings. So I'll just go back to the map quickly. This vast swath of territory in the kind of light pink represents French colonial possessions, and they use those places to recruit hundreds of thousands of men to fight in the French name. And they did so, that's the sort of the French part of it. For the African men like Conde Camara, why did they sign up? They signed up because they believed that service with the French would secure them some access to future authority within the colonial structure, that they would benefit from being closely aligned with colonial officers and administrators. And they believed that it would position them better in post-war society than perhaps they had been before it. That's the kind of volunteer story. There's also a story of mass conscription and massive recruitment or conscription drives that rounded up young men who were not volunteers, but who were nonetheless sent to fight in places far, far away from their homes with very little investment in any of the causes that perhaps would have motivated young men in Europe to fight. I'll skip that for now. These are just some images from another colonial context, German East Africa, which is the place that I've studied most in depth. These are so-called askari, soldiers of the German colonial army that fought in East Africa. These were the ones who waged that long campaign that I talked about a few minutes ago. And here you can just see them in actual ceremonial formation. Here they are practicing kind of an assault on a compound, and you probably can't see in this image, but they all have kind of vegetation on their headgear, probably an attempt to practice doing camouflage, as many militaries have done. And then here, target practice. So as you can see, these are armies that have been trained in a European style. They wear khaki uniforms, but with some local additions or adjustments that reflect other kinds of cultural attributes and desires to reflect that the army was a colonial one. And here's a kind of battle scene which shows the rifles that they used, which emitted a lot of smoke. They were very old rifles. This is kind of the formation that became the iconic marker of the war in East Africa. And I just want to make one point here, which is that it's quite different from anything you've probably ever seen for the war in Europe. It, again, gives you a sense of the difference in war fighting, but also the scale. These soldiers are marching in a column. This is the primary military formation that was used in colonial warfare. This column reflects both the soldiers, so the people that you see in this image are primarily soldiers. But at the end of that long column, it would have been very likely that there would have been people like this included. These were porters who carried all of the soldiers' supplies, equipment, food, water for the entire column, and really anything that the column needed to be able to continue marching. As I guess I haven't mentioned yet, this was a highly mobile campaign, and this map, really the only thing I want to show you here, and again, probably hard for you to see, but the campaign that the commander of the German forces waged took him and his column all the way into what is today Mozambique, and he finally surrendered way over here in what is today Zambia. So it was a highly mobile campaign that could have only been waged through this kind of formation. There's the commander, General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck, who also has a really interesting post-war history that I can talk about if people are interested. This is one of the only surviving images of the surrender scene. So you'll recall that I mentioned that General von Lettow-Vorbeck surrendered finally in Zambia about 2 weeks after the armistice was signed in Europe. And what you see represented in this image, which was drawn by an unknown African artist, lost my cursor, there it is. On this side, the German askari, on this side, the British troops. And what I love about this image is the way that it sort of subtly depicts the conditions that the German colonial army found itself in. So over here, there's a horse, over here, a car, which suggests that the British actually had more access to supplies than the Germans did. And there are some other really interesting details about this image. But it is one representation that shows us sort of this moment when von Lettow-Vorbeck finally surrenders his remaining column. Okay, so I'm actually going to conclude there because I know you stopped promptly at 1, and I want to make sure that there is some time for you to ask me questions. This last image here is one that shows the condition of the remaining troops at the end of the war. You can see that they are no longer in those kind of pristine khaki uniforms. They look quite bedraggled, but they're all looking directly at the camera, and to me this is suggestive of a kind of continuing investment in their relationship to their commanders at the end of the war. And it's very difficult to know what happened to these men. The sources are very hard to trace, but these are the people that I am interested in studying. I've studied them for a long time, and I hope that this gives you kind of a sense of some of the dynamics of the war for Africans, and hopefully raises some questions for you about things you might have missed over your lives. Thank you. Yes?
The picture you showed of the porters, were those women carrying things?
It's often hard to tell, but certainly women were porters. And I mean, one of the interesting features of these columns is that they incorporated soldiers' families into them. So the soldiers left home with their families, their children, and other domestic dependents who helped the soldiers actually to be able to continue kind of performing their roles as family men, as householders in the field. So again, it's quite a different dynamic from the war in Europe, but yeah, the women are certainly doing this kind of work as well. Yes?
So post-war, Germany didn't really have those colonies anymore?
Correct.
And so how were they then appropriated as countries or colonies? What did they become?
So, yeah, what happened in the Versailles settlement was that all of those territories were essentially given to the occupying powers. So for German East Africa, it went to the British, with the exception of what is today Rwanda and Burundi, which went to Belgium. So this was the Belgian Congo. Cameroon was split between the French and the British. Togo similarly was split. And what was German Southwest Africa, present-day Namibia, came under South African Mandate control. So that's the basic answer. Yeah. Yes.
I have two questions. One, how did you become so keenly interested in Africa in World War I? And number two, have you continued your research as to what happened in Africa in World War II?
Well, the short answer to your question is that, the first question is that I was raised in the Air Force. My dad was in the Air Force, and then I was as well. And in the mid-90s, I decided to get a master's degree in African history. I learned German as I was growing up because my dad was stationed there. And my advisor at the time advised me to start studying the former German colonies because they were understudied and I had the language capacity to do it. And so in a way, all of that then congealed into, or kind of made me focus on that campaign. I happened to study East Africa for a variety of reasons that I can talk to you about afterwards if you're interested. But that campaign really sort of encapsulated for me a number of really interesting questions that I wanted to answer about who these men were, the soldiers that I ended with. I wanted to know kind of what drove them to fight for the Germans, which felt like a very odd arrangement for reasons that you might understand if you know anything about German history in the 20th century. So that was the origin of it, and the book I wrote for my dissertation was a study of those soldiers, but of course the World War I story is the one that often draws people into understanding the war on the continent. The second question about World War II, I have not gone much further than World War I. I continue to be very immersed in World War I. And surprisingly, there hasn't been a ton of kind of social or cultural history work done for World War II in Africa. There's been quite a bit of military history, as you might imagine, for North Africa, and then some of the East African campaigns. There were soldiers sent from the British colonies to Burma, and some of those men have been studied. But it's much less developed, actually, than for World War I. Yes, in the back.
Were the African troops integrated with the European troops, of course, and also the veterans of that war, did they become the leaders of national movements for independence, or did that not happen until really after World War II?
On the first question, that word integration is an interesting one because the leaders, the officers who led these forces, there were only a few, right? I mean, in relation to the thousands of African troops, I think in this chart you can see there at the beginning there are 70-something white officers and 2 NCOs to command 2,000 troops. And it grows some, but still the numbers are relatively small. So what is integration in that context? I'm not sure. These men were always assumed, they were never expected to command white troops, right? So the structure was such that white officers and NCOs were always at the top of the command structure. And that never changed, at least in the German case. Your second question, sorry, can you remind me? Yeah, it's interesting. For the German case, some of the men begin to chart a sort of course through the 1920s that looks like they're sort of the precursor generation to the nationalists. They're the ones who learn how to write, they learn how to communicate in the language of self-determination that comes out of Versailles. They are quite conservative in many ways. Their interests have to do with very kind of local concerns and being able to become upwardly mobile. But through the skill sets that they develop, they become kind of the foundation for that next generation who do push the independent movement to fulfillment after World War II. But it takes some time. Yeah.
What happened to the European officers who were there? Did they go back to Europe, or did they stay and become free? Well, they would have been displaced because...
Yeah. So in all of these situations, whichever occupying force took hold of a territory, they interned the opposing force. So for German East Africa, it was a bit of a flip-flop. The Germans first interned any British or French or anybody else, any other nationals that were inside of their territory. But then once the British occupied a significant portion of what had been German East Africa, they began to intern the Germans. And those men were actually sent to POW camps as far away as India. And it took many months, years in some cases, for them to make it back home. So it's a complicated story, but essentially whatever side you were on in relation to the big geopolitical picture, that's also where you fell in terms of your fate during the war. So.
One more question. Okay. Sort of a follow-up on Jim's. International students here that I respect often, they retain their ethnic background, Belgian, Congo, or French. Are there any German enclaves of language and culture still in those German colonies?
Yes. So all of what is today Namibia continues to have a significant German population. They're actually very interesting because they still speak a German that linguists say sounds and looks like what German would have looked like in the late 19th century when the colony was established. And they've, as you might predict, this was a place that was occupied by South Africa and became essentially another province of South Africa in the early 20th century, which meant that it was subject to all of the same apartheid conditions and laws that shaped South Africa for the 20th century. And so that means that the German settlers who were in what is today Namibia retained control over lands that they'd had for decades and which had been taken from the indigenous peoples of that place. So there's an interesting kind of affinity between South Africans and Germans that lasted throughout the 20th century. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Michelle. And in recognition of you speaking to our group this afternoon, we're going to be making a contribution to the Interfaith Winter Shelter, recognizing you being here with us today. So thank you again. Our couple final announcements. Our program next week is Courtney Payne with Girls Riders, Greeter, Joy Harder, Pledge Reflection, Judy Schroeder, and introduction of guests, Steve Engel and Kyla will be doing the roundabout. Quick reminder, forgot to mention it, but November 20th. Mark your calendars for the program November 20th. That's going to be Zach DePue, former concert master of the ISO, will be here. Anybody that would be interested to see a world-class violinist before he goes and chases his next endeavor, he'll be right here performing some songs and just having some dialogue about his career. Thought for the week, I think this one's appropriate. Voting is the expression of our commitment to ourselves, one another, this country, and this world. And that is by Sharon Salzberg. All right, please join me in the four-way test as we head out for the afternoon. Of the things we think, say, or do, first, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? Fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? And fifth, is it fun? Have a great afternoon, everybody.